Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here this afternoon. Nice to see that there's a nice mix of people both in person and online. And we are, as you may have just noticed, recording this session as well for people that aren't able to be here who may still want to hear about it later. So thank you if you're also watching the recording at a later date. So for those of you that I haven't met before, my name is Kate Cook. I'm a registered social worker and the former social worker for Hospice Huronia before Sarah stepped into that role when I transitioned into private practice doing grief therapy full time. So thank you for inviting me to be here today. Hospice kind of keeps me around for these opportunities just to keep my foot in the door because hospice is such a special part of my life and very dear to me. So I appreciate being able to reconnect with all of you again today. Before I hop into it, I'm just going to turn off my camera here just so I don't get in the way of the PowerPoint presentation. But while I do that, just a bit of background about me. So before working with hospice, I was fortunate enough to work in Ontario, Alberta, and BC as a social worker in a variety of settings, including home and community care, in the hospital, oncology, hospice, of course, and bereavement. So I've been doing this for quite a long time. And the reason we're doing this seminar today is just noticing that this time of year for anybody, whether you're grieving the loss of somebody or caring for somebody who's near end of life or struggling with any type of life-limiting illness, is a really tough time, right? And people need a lot of support. And I would say even more so over the last couple of years with the pandemic and all of the other losses that we've encountered, right? And so we just wanted to allow this time to share a few ideas about how do we get through this season, or if you're supporting somebody who may be struggling, maybe some things to consider or ways that you can show up for them during this time. Just not letting me turn my camera off, so I guess you get to see my face the whole time here, which is just fine with me as well. And I will, before I hop in too much further, also preface this with saying I'm on day 14 of this flu bug going around. And so if my voice is a little bit froggy or a little bit crackly, I do apologize. I'm trying to project as much as I can, but haven't had a voice for the past week here. So today's the first day it's actually been a bit clear. So hopefully it comes through loud and clear on your end. But if you do have any trouble hearing me, Sarah, just let me know, or you can leave a message in the chat box there as well. The other thing with questions is we'll also get to questions and leave some time at the end. If there's anything that comes up for you during the presentation that you need a bit of clarity on or want to explore a bit further, you can feel free to leave that in the chat or ask Sarah in the room there, and we will make time for that as well. Okay. And so what we're going to do today is just look at briefly at a bit of an overview of grief. We're going to look at how has grief been affected during the pandemic. We're going to look at how do we plan ahead for the holiday seasons, right? And how do we hold space for all of the emotions that come up during this time? We'll also touch a bit on how do we honor kind of those older rituals, traditions, and memories that we have, while also still making space for moving forward, right? And making space for new memories and ways of connecting to our person during the holiday season. And we'll also touch on a few ideas of activities that we can do if you feel like there's some way I want to honor my person, whether it's involving children or as a family, some different activities that you could consider for that. So I always like to start just with a bit of an idea of defining grief, just because there's lots of different terms that get tossed around. And really, I like to start with the first one, and this is one that Dr. Alan Wolfelt, who's quite a grief guru in the States, he also likes to stress the importance of this word bereavement, right? We often talk about grief, but the concept of bereavement comes from the root word reeve, which literally means to be torn apart, right? Our lives are torn apart, our souls are torn apart, our hearts feel like something is missing. Right. And so I find if you approach grief in the concept of bereavement, it really does validate for people that it's not just a small injury, right? A small thing that we can get over in a day or two. We've been torn apart by this loss, right? And allowing ourselves permission to feel what we need to feel as long as we need to feel it, because it's such a big change in our lives. Grief, of course, is everything that we think and feel after a person dies, or the natural human response to loss, right? So it's very internal, the things we're processing and thinking about on a day-to-day basis about our loss. Whereas mourning is the kind of the outward expression of our grief. It's how we share our grief with others, right? And how people bear witness to the grief that we've experienced. So first, I wanted to get into kind of grief in the pandemic. It's hard to believe that we're coming up on 3 years. In some ways, it feels like 10, and others, it feels like it's been a matter of weeks, right? And so the first part of that, of course, is acknowledging it's not just the death of somebody that we're grieving. We've grieved so much more in the idea of what's called collective grief, right? That we've also had so many other losses as big as the loss of just normalcy, right? The normal routines, that normal sense of safety that we carry in going out into the world. I had a conversation with a client last night just about how even doing things that we look forward to and joyful and things we really want to do with others feels different now. It feels a bit more nuanced. We can't just go out without thinking about, should I wear a mask? Who's going to be there? Will I be at risk? Everything just feels a bit different there, and that lack of normalcy that we're all missing, and noticing the relationships that have changed during the pandemic as well. From a grief standpoint, from the loss of a person standpoint, one of the big changes that we've dealt with over the past 3 years is the lack of ability for ritual and celebration, right? And so I think about our folks that came to hospice in early 2020 and even 2021 who weren't able to have funerals or had funerals or celebrations or masses on a much, much smaller scale than they may have liked to, right? And so instead of having a gathering of 100 people, they were maybe able to choose 5 and having to make really difficult decisions about who those 5 or 10 people could be. And sometimes that included funeral home staff, priests or pastors, right? And the cemetery staff. The really difficult decisions having to be made. And what we've seen over the past several months is people starting to, with obviously ability to gather on a larger scale, starting to think about, do we now proceed with having the funeral or the celebration of life that we weren't able to have? And their grief is resurfacing in a very different way, right? So it's been kind of a longer, more prolonged grief experience for people who've suffered loss any time in the last 3 years of just not knowing what's normal and what should we do and when. Right? We've also been able to have limited gatherings. And when I say gatherings, it's just that ability to have social support, right? The lack of social support of being with our friends and family when we're hurting and struggling, right? Being able to gather for the holidays or special days or even just tough days, right? We weren't able to do that for such a long time. And even now that we can, there's still a bit of hesitation around, are we safe to do that for some people, right? And so it just feels very different and we feel a bit more unsure of what's the best option for us. We also have had limited access to support programs during that time. So fortunately for hospice, I know Hospice Huronia in particular, we tried our very best to keep programs going all throughout the pandemic, whether that was online or doing things with the social distancing outside, having people more spaced out with masks on. We tried our very best to keep programs going because we know people need that opportunity to connect with others that understand from a shared experience, right? People that have experienced maybe not the same type of loss, but understand loss and the nuances of that in a world where people don't always understand grief and what we're experiencing unless they've gone through that. Right. So that really has impacted the grief experience over the past few years. And programs, of course, are opening up now, but people are finding, my grief is coming up in a way I just haven't experienced yet. Right. Even though my person may have died a long time ago, it still feels very raw. Right. And so coming to programs can still be very hard for them. We also have a lot of varying experiences with the first happening right now. So often in grief, you'll hear people give the recommendation of you just have to get through all the firsts, right? So the first holiday, the first birthday, the first Christmas, the first Hanukkah, the first Easter, the first Thanksgiving, and then, it should get a little bit easier from there. But because of our lack of ability to gather and meet and celebrate during the past couple years, you have to be mindful of that a lot of people for this holiday season, this may be the first time they've gathered in 3 years, right? Or 2.5 years. So for them, even though it's not the first year calendar wise, it may be the first year they're having to be in these larger social settings and having to share their grief on a larger scale, right? The last couple holiday seasons may have been 1 or 2 people around, or maybe, a small intimate group, our social bubbles, if you remember that. This year might be the first time someone's coming into larger social settings and gatherings and sharing their grief or experiencing it in a different way. That's just something I wanted people to be mindful of, maybe for yourself if you're going through grief or you're supporting someone in grief, is that even though it's not the first year, it can still very much feel like it because it's the first year they've been able to maybe gather in a larger sense. So I wanted to share this quote. It's actually from an article that came out recently in what's called Bustle, and I have a link to it at the end for those that are online or attending in person. You'll get handouts, I'm sure, if you need a copy of that. But it's from Mary Potter Kenyon, and she shares that if it means doing everything the same or everything differently, find what works for you. And I think that's the big takeaway for today is we'll talk about some different ideas. And it's kind of put back to you to reflect on what do I need this year? What do I need that to look like to feel safe in my grief, right? Do I need to kind of scrap everything and start over? Do I need to kind of keep everything consistent because my world has changed so much? I can't bear another change or transition right now. I want you to think about, for me, what do I need right now to make me feel secure and safe and cared for this holiday season? And we'll talk a bit more about that. So the one thing I really caution people to think about, because this is often one of the biggest struggles when supporting somebody in grief approaching the holiday season, is it's often a season that's very laden with love and joy and happiness and togetherness and family. We see it everywhere this time of year in the commercials and the music and the TV shows and movies that are on 24/7, right? We get bombarded with that on a constant basis throughout the months of November and December, especially. Right. And so for a lot of people in grief, a lot of those themes can feel really out of reach or really difficult to even manage. Right. And so often I'll hear clients share things like the idea of joy or happiness or trying to be grateful even is really out of reach for me. I don't feel like that's something I can connect to. And that's something that people that support grievers will often say, well, just try to reach for gratitude, right? At least, you might not be happy or joyful, but you can be grateful for what you have. But for somebody who's been torn apart, right, quite literally torn apart, it might feel really out of reach to even try gratitude, right? Maybe I'm not grateful right now. Maybe I'm quite angry that I've lost this person I cared for. And I'm really angry at the situation that I'm in. Maybe I'm a single parent now and raising children in grief and I can't take care of myself right now. Maybe gratitude feels a bit out of reach. And so I encourage you to think about what are some of those emotions that do feel safe for you to connect to, right? And so the kind of message that I try to give is maybe it's not joy or gratitude. Maybe it's just the peace of being, right? Can I just be in that moment and just sit in that moment for a second? Maybe joy feels out of reach or happiness, but maybe I can focus on contentment, right? If it's as simple as narrowing it down to a moment, can I sit down and enjoy a hot cup of coffee and watch my grandchildren in the corner coloring together, playing with their new toys together, and just focus on just being, right? Not having to be happy or sad or anything else, but just being in that moment, right? And knowing that that's okay, right? If we're just kind of in the moment and surviving, that's okay too. And knowing that it's normal for us to be able to have moments of happiness in that, right? We can have duality in those experiences. It doesn't have to be either or, it's and. We can feel happiness in the moment, but also notice who we're missing and feel some sorrow in that, some sadness. You don't have to choose emotions. As we know in grief, it's not a linear process. As much as we'd like it to be step one, step two, step three, it's a bit of a mesh, right? It's a lot of emotions all at once. And so I want you to allow yourself to feel the range of emotions as they come and just focus on that being, right? Just acknowledging what comes up as it comes up and just sitting in that. So part of that is being able to acknowledge absence, right? Who we're missing, who's not here, but maybe also noticing the presence of who are the people around me right now, right? Who's here supporting me, who's taking care of me, right? If somebody's there helping you through the holiday season, who's listening, right? And also that focus on maybe there's a need for you for some togetherness, some people around you to support you, but you may also feel there's times during the holidays that you just need space. And that's okay too to ask for that. If it's not uncommon for families this time of year, especially to try to kind of overcompensate a bit in that hovering, right? That trying to take care of and take over sometimes, even assuming that's what we might need. But a lot of times what people in grief are feeling is, I'm so exhausted, I just need some space. And it's okay to ask for that as well, right? And respecting that others in your family may have different grief needs than yours, right? So as much as it's important for you to identify what your needs and wants might be, recognizing that that might not be in line with others that have experienced the same loss in your family, right? So if you lost your husband and you're struggling with grief this year, recognize that your children's needs may be very different. They might want to approach the holidays in a very different way. They might want you there 24/7 where you need a bit of space, right? And so it's opening up some conversation about what each of you need to feel that you're all being respected and validated. So one thing I want you to think about leading into the holiday season, as we know in grief, a lot of times it's the anticipation to the event that can be worse than the actual day itself. Right? We hear that kind of time and time again of, I'm dreading this first birthday that's coming up. It's going to be a really hard day. And they get so anxious leading up to that day that the day comes and, it's actually not so bad. It was the days leading up to it that were worse. Right. And so, as much as you can, it's focusing in on what you can control right now, knowing that that day could be, really, really difficult, or it might not be so bad. Right. So, trying to focus in on what is in your control right now in the moment as much as you can. To think about, are there events or days that might feel overwhelming for you? Right. If there's a certain ceremony or event that your family typically has during this time of year, is that something you might be able to not go to? Right. If you feel there's too many people around, I'll be overwhelmed, or it's too emotional. Right. If I usually go to, let's say, Christmas Eve mass, and this year it just feels too much, can I not do that this year? It's not feeling right for me. It's not what I need. Right. So thinking about, are there events or days that might be overwhelming that we can say no to just for now? Right. It's temporary. Are there commitments that you can say no to or pass on to someone else? So I think a lot of, especially in the older generations, the matriarchs of the family who've always hosted, the Hanukkah dinners or the Christmas dinners, and that's been their role in the family. But all of a sudden they've got this big loss of somebody, right? And they feel a pressure to, I have to still host. That's my role. I do it every year. Are there times that maybe we can be kinder to ourselves and say no, and either pass that to somebody else or bring in some help? Right? Recognizing that when we're grieving, we have a much lower energy store. Typically, our mental bandwidth is a lot lower, our physical energy is lower. We might need to bring in some help with this to make it feel more manageable, right? And allowing yourself permission to recognize that and say no to things that don't serve you right now. The other caution I have is, do you need to limit your time spent with others, right? So think about, if there's, the normal routine would be I'd go to my daughter's during the day at noon and I'd stay there till dinner and have presents after dinner and go home at 9 o'clock. Does that feel too much? Is there a way to pare that down so that it feels more manageable from an energy standpoint? Can I go just for dinner? Or can I go in the afternoon before all the other guests are coming and I won't feel so overwhelmed? Can we limit that time so that it feels more safe for me? Right? From an energy standpoint and a mental standpoint. Can you think of a way to express the needs of those around you? And sometimes that means making a list, right? And so anybody that's experienced a loss has heard this phrase, I'm sure, 100 times, of let me know what I can do to help you. And when we're in the thick of grief and in the fog of it, especially during the holiday season when the world is go, 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 we don't know what help we need sometimes, right? And so that question gets asked and we go blank and we just say, I don't know, and we continue to do things ourselves. If you've got a few quiet moments at home or when you're out and about, start to think about, are there some actual tangible things that those who want to help me could do for me, right? Is it I need them to go out and do grocery shopping because I just am too tired this week, or I've got this big get together and it's overwhelming me? Can I outsource that to somebody who's offering to help? Is there shopping that needs to be done? Christmas shopping, presents for Hanukkah. Can I outsource that to them? Can I just get help with snow removal, right? That's always a big one this time of year, just the energy to do things around the house, the maintenance, the snow removal, the upkeep of a yard, taking your car in for service. Start thinking about some of those more practical things that people can tangibly help you with, because they do want to help. They just don't know what you need, right? And when you're in the thick of it and put on the spot with that question of let me know what you need, you don't always know at that time either, right? So having a list ready for those that are kind of standing around and supporting you might be a way of just getting a bit of help through the holiday season without the pressure, right? The last point there is really, again, about paring down expectations, knowing these can change at any times and recognizing that it's okay to do nothing, right? And so normally if your house is the house that's decked to the nines with lots of Christmas trees and lights, and you've got the Christmas village, or you've got lots of decorations, you love being a host, it's okay to do none of that if that's what you need to do this year, right? It's okay to take a year off. Or maybe it's, I'm going to put some lights up, but I don't feel like the tree this year, right? It's okay to do that. Or if you feel like I need to do that because people are coming over, who can come in and help you do that, right? So that it doesn't feel like a burden to you or an emotional taxation for you to do that, right? And just to know that it's okay to do nothing and that this is temporary, right? This is maybe just for a year or two, and honoring that that's what you need. So that kind of blends into the next slide here of honoring your own needs. So for some, we do see that maintaining traditions and rituals can be very therapeutic for them. As I said, for people in loss, sometimes so much of their life has changed that this time of year is something they really enjoy. They've always done things a certain way, and that consistency is going to carry them through. They feel like so much of my world has changed. I at least need to know I can count on, this couple of days to look a certain way because that's how we've always done it. And I just need people around and I need to feel okay. Right. And that's great. That works for them. For others, everything needs to change, right? I don't want to decorate. I don't want to host. I don't want to gather. And that's what they need this year. They just need space and they need time, right? And I think that's a very personal choice. For most, I find on that spectrum, it's a bit of both, right? They need a little bit of something, some connection, right? That social connection is so important when we're going through loss, but they don't maybe feel like celebrating or gathering or hosting, right? We don't have the energy to do that. And all of those options are okay. It's your own personal individual need that you have to think about, not what others may have expected of you or what they may normally be used to for you doing, right? What the normal traditions are in your family. It's what do you need this year to get through and to feel safe. So I wanted to share this tool, and this is just a small snippet of it. It's a much larger document, just a few pages there. This tool comes from a resource called the Dougy Center, which is a grief education center for children and families in the US. And what they've created is for families, a holiday planning worksheet. And what this worksheet does is, just as I mentioned a few slides ago, all of our needs in grief are very unique to each other, right? Based on our own experience in grief, the way we process grief, we all have different needs. What this conversation guide does is it gets families to start to think about how are we as a family going to approach the holiday season this year? And it has a few examples here. Do we want to attend our usual parties this year? Will we host a gathering? Do we want to include the memory of the person who has died? How will we do that? How will we have conversations about the person who died? And I think this is a very gentle way to start that conversation as a family because a lot of assumptions get made during this time, right? A lot of times, especially in grief, and the reason why most people seek grief support is those around them feel they don't want to talk about it, right? They avoid talking about their person because they don't want to upset the person who's experienced loss. When really, most times it's quite the opposite, right? We want to talk about them. We want to share memories. We want to feel connected to them during the holidays, right? And so sometimes it helps to have these conversations as a family of how do we support each other in our grief or even in our friend groups, right? If it's not family, the friend groups that you're around during this time of year. What are some new traditions that we might want to start? Is there a way we can honor our person during these times? Thinking about traditions, do we send cards or newsletters? I know I joke about kind of the traditional Christmas letters that we all used to send, and maybe some of you still do, of everything that's happened this year in our family and who's doing what and where. Can I let that go for this year? Is there a need for that? Do I have to send holiday cards or can I put that aside for a year? People knowing that I'm going through a loss and they wouldn't expect that of me. So why do I put that pressure on myself to do this? Do I want to attend faith or community services, but I feel supported by that, or does it feel like a chore? Right? One of the big ones that often people will consider as a family is, do we need to take a trip or vacation? Maybe this house we're living in is steeped with memories that are just too much this time of year, and we all need to get away and have a change of scenery. Right? The other one being, do we visit the cemetery memorial spot on the holiday or a significant day to connect with them, right? To connect with the person who's died. What traditions are connected to the person who's died and which new ones could we maybe create? And how do we carve out time for ourselves and our reactions during this time? Who can we go to for support and care? I think this is a great resource. And again, there's a link to this at the end of the presentation if you wanted to look at that document further. But I find it's just a really good conversation tool for families just to start to think about, right? And I know it's getting closer. It's a couple weeks till Christmas now, almost hard to believe. But I do find if you feel a bit stuck in how to have that conversation with family, this could be a gentle way to do that. And so I wanted to share a client story. This is somebody actually that came through hospice's doors. So I call her Mrs. R. She lost her husband right at the start of the pandemic, April 2020. Leading up to the 2020 holiday season, she worked with her grief counselor, knowing that the holiday season is going to be difficult, right? She wanted to prepare for the upcoming celebrations and gatherings. So she decided it would be best for her to be with family during this time, knowing that she often felt anxious and alone in her own home. She decided to make her husband's favorite dish to bring to the meal that was prepared by her daughter, where 20 other friends and family members were in attendance. And if you can think back to that time, we weren't gathering on a large scale at that time. So this was quite a big deal for her, and maybe even bending the rules a bit at that time. But it was the family's decision to do this in a supportive place for those who were grieving, right? They just wanted to be together, and that's okay. As soon as the dinner started, Mrs. R noticed she felt an overwhelming sense of urgency to leave. So she sat down, looked around, and felt a bit of panic, right? She looked around and noticed all of those in attendance, but she was also made hyper aware of who was not in attendance, who was absent at that table, and began to experience a feeling of panic, overwhelm, and emotional distress. And unfortunately, what happened in this case is she ended up getting up in the middle of dinner and left. She went home, right? And so I wanted to share the story of, even if we do the hard work, right, and we think about all of these things ahead of time, the best laid plans, there are times where we really truly don't know how we will feel until we're in that situation. And so I want you to think about planning ahead as much as you can, but also if it goes sideways when we get there, when that day comes and maybe it's not what we expected or we feel much more than we expected to, how do we then care for self at that time, right? What's our kind of plan B? What's our backup plan? Our emotional safety plan to care for ourselves. Because I thought she felt quite a sense of control going into that situation and was really caught off guard with that strong visceral reaction she had, just noticing everybody's here but him, right? And so knowing that that's okay to acknowledge that, but also being aware of then what's the plan? How do we care for you as a family and support system? How do we care for you? And what do you need in that moment if things go sideways? Right. And so one of the things that I often will share with clients is think of what your kind of your first aid kit would be emotionally in that case. Right. If you start to feel panicked and overwhelmed and anxious, what's your go-to for coping? Right. So if for a lot of people it's I just need to sit and do some deep breathing and I need to kind of try to regulate myself a little bit. Other people, they're so in their heads at that time, they need somebody else to coach them through that. So is there a family member or friend who can support you? I also encourage clients to think about something like the app Insight Timer or Calm or Headspace, to have that on their phone. So if you're in public and this happens, you have these grief bursts that happen unexpectedly most of the time, or you're in a social setting and this happens, just as in this case, can you pull out your phone, go to another room, throw on, even just a 3 or 5 minute meditation of somebody guiding you through it, right? Insight Timer is one of my favorites because it's free and there's such a variety of meditations on that app that are just a few minutes. Some of them are even as short as 1 minute, just to help ground us and give us a second to catch our breath and then assess, am I safe to go back into that? Or do I truly need to go home, right? I'm too overwhelmed, I'm too flooded with emotion, right? But just giving yourself those tools to deal with what happens when things don't go as planned. So that goes in with planning for emotional safety, right? If we're in this situation, things don't go as planned, can we take breaks as needed? What does that look like? So I encourage you to think about, if you're going somewhere over the holidays, what is a bit of an escape route if things go sideways? If we're at a family member's house, is there a room or a place that I feel safe that I can escape to just for a few minutes to gather my thoughts? If I get quite emotional, can I just have some privacy where people won't chase me if I don't want that, right? I just want space. Can I go for a walk? I need a change of scenery. I just need to get away. Think about, who do I want, or do I want to be alone in that space? This time of year, especially when we're really flooded with emotions, thinking about stepping outside just for fresh air, that cold exposure, that cold air, taking long, deep breaths of cold air really does help reset our nervous system, helps us regulate. So thinking about, can I just go outside and get a bit of cold exposure and help reset my nervous system? Knowing to expect the unexpected and allowing ourselves to honor our own needs, right? So in this case, I think in the case I just shared, family maybe was a bit upset or offended that she left at that time because she was not coping and needed to get out of there. But I think, exploring that further, I think they understand in the moment that's what she needed to do and she trusted that, right? In her mind, there was no coming back from this. I go back to the table and I'll just be flooded again. And she left, right? That's what she needed to do. And that's okay. Even if family didn't understand or maybe support that at the time, right? So deciding where you need to be. Is it at home or do I need a change of scenery? Planning time with those who are supportive and comforting. So that's something that comes up time and time again, is really being mindful of who's around you during the holiday season. Are they people who you feel safe to express your grief to? Or can you show up as you are? Maybe you're not talking about your person you don't feel comfortable to, but can you at least show up as you are? Don't feel that you have to mask what you're truly feeling, right? People that won't be upset if you do leave early or do have to shorten your visit or maybe come a bit later because you're having a tough day or change plans. Thinking about who are those core supportive people that I do feel safe with in grief, and maybe limiting time with those who don't feel safe or don't understand, right? And so thinking about who's going to be there, who feels safe for you, and trying to be a bit mindful of that if you can. The other caution I have in terms of planning for emotional safety is just being mindful of the triggers that come up this time of year with things like music and television and movies. So I remember a grief client a long time ago. She said, this time of year, what I do is I put headphones in anytime I'm in public or the car or anywhere else. And I choose the music I listen to because every Christmas song is horrible for me. It's very triggering for me because it's all about family and connection and coming home and togetherness. Right. And so any Christmas music was very triggering for her. So her way of controlling that was putting in headphones and playing her own music that had nothing to do with the holiday season. Right, and so it's just trying to be mindful of those things that could be triggering and trying to plan an alternate for that helps you feel safe. So I'll just share briefly a bit of our family story around loss during the holiday season. So it's actually 50 years this year, on Christmas Eve, actually. It was before I was born, of course, but my mom's sister, my Aunt Heather, was a nurse in her kind of early to mid 20s on her way to work the morning of Christmas Eve, 8 months pregnant, driving in from the country into Windsor Regional Hospital. And unfortunately, it was killed by a drunk driver on her way into work that day. Right. And so, as you can imagine, Christmas Eve for my family, for my mom and her siblings and my grandparents, was always a really difficult day. Of course, that year, the most difficult, it happened the day before Christmas. They lost a sister and a future nephew. Right. And so for many, many years, what the family expressed was that day was just never a day of celebration. They never gathered, they never celebrated. It just felt so wrong to them to do anything that they totally blocked that day out and treated it like any other day. Right? That was a day that was laden with pain for them, and they never wanted to acknowledge the loss on that day or even just talk about it. Right? It was just a day to be forgotten. Over time, once they started to reflect on that, and once my brothers and I were born, they wanted to kind of shift that focus a little bit. So they thought about, our kids have never met Heather or my Aunt Heather. How do we then connect them to Heather and share our story with them so they get to know her, but also that she is now a part of our story, right? And how do we celebrate her and have this be a time of togetherness when something big was taken from us? How do we change those traditions? Right. And so slowly with time, we started to think about, as a family, how do we honor her on that day? Do we make her favorite dish, which we do, right? Do we do her favorite cookies, which we do now, right? One of the favorite movies at that time for them was It's a Wonderful Life. So every year, Christmas Eve, no matter where my family is, we live in different provinces. We all sit down at the same time and watch It's a Wonderful Life together, right? That's a priority that we've made as a family to connect. But I also wanted to touch on just knowing that some of these changes that you might make in grief, again, are very temporary, right? For my family, it took decades to get to that place of feeling like they could acknowledge anything on Christmas Eve. And that's what they needed at the time, right? They were angry, they were hurt, they were scared. They had two big losses on that day. But with time, allowing yourself permission to honor and celebrate and feel grateful for that person in your life is also okay if that feels right for you. So I put that quote at the bottom of the song, I'll Be Home for Christmas. For many, that's a beautiful Christmas song. In our family, it's turn it off, right? Turn it as soon as it comes on the radio, turn it off. Because for my family, that means my aunt going away to work and never coming home for Christmas, right? And so my family doesn't listen to that song. It's too hard for them, even 50 years later. Right? I talked to my mom just the other day about her experience with loss at this time, and she said, can you believe it's 50 years and it still feels like it was yesterday, and I still cry when I hear that song. I can't listen to it, right? And so just knowing that that's okay, that it can be months, years, anytime, and that grief can still be very raw, and it's okay to acknowledge that and do what you need to do and honor your own needs. One of the big cautions I have, because the holiday season tends to be really busy, and as we mentioned, sometimes family members really overcompensate and try to fill our schedules and really take us under their wing and keep us busy and take us away from home and bring us to all the parties. try to focus on not overscheduling yourself, right? So if you've got a day planner or you put things in your phone, check in with your calendar right now and just make sure you haven't fully booked yourself every day of the week, all day during the holiday season, especially in the month of December, right? Allowing that space for grief and allowing that space for healing, for rest, knowing that going out and doing things like family dinners or gatherings or parties or socials or just attending even a church service can take so much more energy from us than it normally would before the losses that we experienced, right? And just knowing we need a bit more time to recoup during this season. It's also not uncommon, of course, when it's winter and it's got shorter, darker days, that we feel just a bit more tired this season, right? It's the season of rest for a reason. We've been busy all year. We need to slow down and really just nurture ourselves right now and notice what comes up for you during that rest time. A lot of times, what we see in grief counseling is people keep themselves so busy in December and they're so surrounded by family because family is worried about them being alone that January comes and it all stops rather abruptly, right? All the socials and dinners are over, all the family have gone back home, and that starkness of being alone at that time can be overwhelming, right? And so, by allowing yourself a bit of that throughout the month of December, when people are gathering that little bit of time to yourself, that change and transition won't be so stark for you, right? And you'll also have that space to get through the holiday season without totally crashing at the end of it, right? So make sure you allow yourself with that. And again, that reminder, just being mindful of who you're around. Do they refuel you, right? Are they supportive and kind and they lift you up? Or are they people that drain you, right? I often refer to them as kind of vampires or energy suckers, or they're people that really just drain you in their presence, right? And trying to limit your exposure to that as much as you can, knowing that this season is hard to begin with, right? And we don't need to add to that. If you are supporting someone in grief, these are just a few ideas of ways that you can do that. So if you're a friend or family member, or have other family members, of course, grieving as well, talk about their person, right? Bring them up in stories if that feels okay for them. Check in with them first, maybe, right? Is it okay if we share some stories about dad today? I really want to remember, right? Encourage them to do things, but don't push, right? So a lot of times we'll see, for example, adult children saying, Mom, I've made the decision. You're coming to my house for Christmas and we're having dinner with 10 people. That might not be what she wants, right? That might not be what she needs, right? And so you could offer it as an option of, Mom, this is what I'm thinking. What do you think? What do you need? Right? Encouraging them to stay connected, but don't push, right? Don't mandate and don't force. Allow it to be what the person needs while also still making sure they're supported. Acknowledging the duality of feelings surrounding that time, again, that happiness or sorrow and joy, we can have space for all of those emotions. Sometimes it's if it's a friend, right, or a kind of a neighbor or somebody that you know at a more distant level, it might be I make a donation in their loved one's memory. This is something hospice sees a lot this time of year, of people making donations in someone's memory, right? Of just a nice way for the family to say, we acknowledge this is a difficult time for you. The holiday season's tough. We've made a donation in so and so, right? And that's their way of just honoring that it's a difficult time. Offering that practical support, avoiding that let me know what I can do. We've already talked a bit about that. Recognizing that plans can change and sometimes last minute, and not blaming them or making them feel shame in that, right? And so I think about times where family members have hosted gatherings and somebody in grief has gone to that and been overwhelmed and had to leave. Sometimes family members get quite upset about that, right? And angry about that because they feel they're doing their best to support them and the grievers just kind of leaving or giving up on that, right? But it's understanding the why behind it. Maybe they're just too overwhelmed or this was too much too fast. Maybe it's just a bad day, right? Not laying blame or shame on them for the decisions they've made, just trying to understand the why. Maybe it just wasn't what they need or wasn't what they thought. And the last point there of just showing up, but keep showing up, right? As I said, sometimes what we see in grief is families are wonderful at supporting through the holiday season. They're there all the time. And people are staying over at each other's houses or picking up mom for the holidays. And then it seems to kind of stop, right? And January is an equally cold and dark and long month, right? And a lot of times people struggle again with that starkness of there's a lot of people all at once and I'm surrounded by love and then it stops, right? So it's making sure throughout the months after the holidays, you keep showing up, right? Keep supporting them, keep checking in, keep offering support. Can I get you groceries, mom? Do you need anything this week? Can I help you with childcare? Whatever that way of offering support may look for you. Keep doing that long after the holiday seasons come because that grief doesn't magically stop after the holiday season. One thing I want people to think about when we look at how do we get through the holiday season when it actually comes is thinking about the old traditions or rituals or celebrations that your family have, and which ones do we feel like we want to honor or carry forward, right? So some examples of that might be, are there recipes that matter to that person that we could do together as a family as our way of honoring them? So I think about in my family, I have my grandma Schmidt from Windsor, who made these phenomenal brownies every year at our extended family Christmas with all the aunts, uncles, and cousins. And when she died, one of her last wishes was, I'm going to give a certain son, one of my uncles, the magic recipe for the brownies. No one else gets it. It's a secret recipe. Only one son gets it. And that's now his task every year when we have our larger family Christmas. He's responsible for the brownies, and that's our way of staying connected to her. For my other grandma, we make her shortbread every year. That was her tried and true recipe, 18 million pounds of butter and a couple chocolate chips. That's her shortbread recipe, right? We do that every year in honor of her. Are there certain decorations we can bring out that have meaning, right? So I think about a lot of ornaments that are very personal that people maybe have made or been involved with making, or they represent them. One of my grandmas really loved cardinals, so we place a cardinal on our tree every year in honor of her. It's our way of staying connected, and each of us have the same ornament, right? That's our way of connecting to her. Are there stories we can share? Movies we can watch together? It's Wonderful Life in my family, right? Are there things we can do together to connect to them? Are there photos or activities we can do to help us stay connected to them? Thinking about what would be helpful, and if there's traditions that felt good before but now feel very different, right? If maybe the families to get together and make pierogies, maybe that doesn't feel okay now. Maybe that feels like that was, grandma's, that was her role in our family, and it just doesn't feel right to do that. Letting go of that if it doesn't feel okay, and that's okay too. Thinking about which ones feel good and letting go of those again that don't. When we look at creating new memories together when we're honoring somebody in grief, it's looking at buying a gift or making a donation to someone else in their honor. So I think about a client even the other day I spoke to said, when I go out to the store, I think about all these things that mom and grandma and all these people that have now died would have really liked. And I think about, it just feels wrong to kind of see them, and I acknowledge my grief. I know they're not here. And then I just keep walking, right? And that feels something's missing there. And so sometimes the recommendation would be, is there an opportunity to still buy that item, but then donate it to somebody that might need it, right? And we're seeing that more and more nationally in kind of drugstores and convenience stores is programs for, let's say, seniors that don't have family or friends who do have very basic needs, right? So I was involved in a program in Edmonton where every London Drugs, which is similar to Shoppers Drug Mart, would have a tree in each store, a wish list for seniors, things like soap, slippers, chocolates, really basic needs, right? Can we do that and pay it forward to somebody who might not have family this time of year? And that's our way of honoring our person. Can we volunteer at an organization that mattered to them or a cause that mattered to them? Another client of mine, really, her husband was involved with Salvation Army and she never was a part of it. She said, that's not for me. That was kind of his thing that he was always interested in. This year, she's involved in delivering hampers for the first time ever, because for her, that's her way of staying connected to something that mattered to him. She's carrying that legacy forward. The idea of leaving an empty chair at the table is one that comes up a lot, and I find people have quite mixed reactions to that. For some, it makes the absence feel that much more heavy and present and can be overwhelming for some to see. For others, it's a place of comfort of, this was dad's spot at the table, and we're going to leave that dad's spot at the table for dinner this year. And that might be what works for that family. For others, that feels too morbid. And so the other suggestion would be, are there people maybe you can invite to fill it? Right? Do you know other people who might be struggling in grief that you can invite to fill that spot at the table? Or is there another way to approach leaving that empty spot that feels more organic for you? Sometimes families will also do things like a memorial table off to the side of all the people that have died. It might be photos or things that represent them, scrapbooks, knickknacks that are important to them. Another way of staying connected is, can we write them a letter, right? Can we kind of share what's been going on for us or what we missed them maybe this holiday season? Another family I work with, the way they approach this is they actually write letters from the perspective of their daughter who has died to them, right? As if she's off traveling somewhere. They imagine that she's off traveling the world right now, and they write letters to the family, to them directly about what she's been up to. And for them, that gives solace and peace. That's their way of staying connected. Can we do ornaments with clothing or keepsakes? A memory stocking or a box, right? Can we hang a stocking or put a box to the side where people can just write down memories of the person? And whether we share them or not, it at least allows opportunity for people to think about them and start those conversations, right? Can we light a candle? Can we just acknowledge it just for a moment, take a moment of silence before the meal starts, before we start a gathering? Can we just light a candle? Or if you're celebrating Hanukkah, maybe you don't go to the larger gatherings. Can you invite somebody over to light the candle with you, right? And be a part of that ceremony. Can we include a favorite dish, right? And the last note there, just being sure that in all of this, thinking about involving children or grandchildren if they wish to, where you can, right? And so a lot of times we try to hide grief from children. We try to shield them for any thinking about the loss or the person that's died, but really involving them in it really helps them understand that this is a normal reaction to loss. We're allowed to talk about them, we're allowed to grieve them. And so I've included in the next slide here a couple of ideas just about how we go about that. And so one of them you'll see, this is actually from hospice. On the left there, you'll see a memory pillow made from shirts, right? And so we often have those out on the front couch at hospice at Tompkins House. That might be a nice way for people to have a tangible connection, right? And so it's taking a favorite article of clothing, usually a shirt, sometimes it's pajamas, and sometimes that's a nice thing to gift people, or it might be a nice thing for yourself, right? To feel connected. I've seen times where people have shirts with little pockets in the front, and what they'll do on holidays is write them a love note or a little letter, just as their way of staying connected. And the middle one is an ornament the nurses in hospice made a couple of years ago, actually, with our residents, just taking a little snippets of their clothing. In this case, it was a pair of pajamas. And it says, "This is clothing I used to wear. Whenever you hold it, feel me near." Right. And so it's just, and again, another tangible item for people to hang on to feel connected during the holiday season. Just a nice thing for families to have as a keepsake. The other one you would have seen in any promotions for hospice lately, the upcoming gingerbread house activity. This is something we've done that really enjoy, just opening up space for children to talk about grief during the holidays, right? And it doesn't have to be a super formal experience. What we do is we've left the parents out historically, just to give them a break because we recognize they also might need a break this time of year. But what it does is it allows conversation for kids to talk about their grief with other kids, right? And so I think about the first year we did this, we had 3 children in there whose grandparent was actually down the hall in hospice currently, right? And they were thinking about their grief, even though the person hadn't yet died. They were acknowledging this is still really difficult. And they were able to meet other children who had already experienced the loss of a grandparent or a parent or somebody close to them that they cared about, and just allowing that space to talk about it. So we look at the candy as a way to be able to describe, if you think of those Hershey kisses around the edge there, who are the people that support you, right? Can you name them? How many are there? Are they all close together? Are they spaced out? Thinking about the candies that we put on the house, what do the colors represent? Are they different emotions? Right? Allowing them to be able to reflect that and draw whatever symbolism they need, right? I remember one child really kind of went nuts with decorating and was a bit chaotic, but they felt that's where their emotional state was at, right? It wasn't neat and orderly and didn't look like this beautiful gingerbread house our nurse Tammy created in the slide here. It was a bit more chaotic and messy, and maybe that house is crumbling, right? Because their world's been turned upside down. It just allows space for conversation, right? And for reflection. These other ones come from the source What's Your Grief? And What's Your Grief is a wonderful website that is a resource for all things grief. And so if there's anything in particular you're struggling with, they have a lovely search option on that website that you can look up things like the holidays, or how do I cope with anger, or why is my grief so bad at nighttime, right? It has some wonderful articles and support. And for anybody experiencing any type of loss, right? Maybe I've lost a child, I'm struggling with that. But this specifically are some examples around, again, the holidays and how do we involve children or family members in doing that. So the top ornament there where you see strands of ribbon, those ribbons represent different emotions, right? So the different colors represent different emotions, and you ask children to choose kind of the length of the ribbon depending on the intensity of that emotion, right? And so if somebody has, let's say, a red ribbon and that represents anger, maybe right now they're in lots of anger, so that ribbon's really long and it might take up most of the ornament, right? Or maybe there's a lot of happiness when they think of their person, and that's maybe a yellow ribbon. And there's a lot of that in the bulb there. So it's just allowing them to reflect again on how they connect to their person, but also tapping into those emotions that we don't always talk about. The memory lantern at the bottom right there, what you're inviting children to do is taking things like tissue paper or any kind of opaque tracing paper that you can find, inviting them to draw memories of their person, right? So it could be a particular scene. They could write things out if they wanted to, draw just a special memory that they have. And what they do is glue those memories to the inside of the lantern so that they're surrounded by it, and allowing them to kind of place usually an LED ideally. You don't want to catch fire on anything in there, an LED candle just to illuminate that lantern. And that can then become a part of a ritual for them. Maybe we just light it on a special day, or maybe that's something they do every night as part of their way of connecting during the holiday season. And that's something that can be used all year round, right? It's just a way to let them connect to their person through memories that they share. And the last one, of course, is just being able to share stories again, right? Connecting through photographs and stories, allowing that space for just conversation, right? And especially with children, letting them know it's okay to talk about them and to keep talking about them. And if maybe we're struggling in grief and it's too much for us, who can we bring in to let the children have space for that, right? Because they certainly need it and we need it, right? So the kind of final takeaways I have for today is just to remember that things might be very different. They might feel very different. Your wants and needs might be very different this year, but this change again does not have to be permanent, right? So remembering that even though maybe I'm not hosting this year, and that's been my role in the family for 60 years, I'm not doing this year, it's not permanent. It's just for right now, right? It's honoring in this moment, this is what I need, hoping for the best and planning for the rest, right? As you saw with that case example, we can do all this hard work and try to anticipate things, but we truly don't know how we'll feel until we get to that moment. And then how do we care for self if it goes sideways, right? Thinking about that emotional first aid kit in a way of what do I need to help me feel grounded? One of my favorite things, again, to recommend to clients is think about even if you can just have a grounding object with you. And a grounding object is very different for each person. So think about what's something you can physically hang on to that's tactile. For some people, it's I need a stress ball. For some, it's I carry my rosary in my pocket. A lot of people, it's even just a rock that's very smooth that I can rub and it's something repetitive. I'll give you an example of my own here. I have a little fidget ring, right? And so it's a ring that I wear on my finger that can spin, that anytime I feel anxious, it's something that grounds me, right? It's something I can do to help feel calm and regulate emotions, right? And so thinking of what are maybe some of those grounding objects that if I'm in the thick of it and I'm surrounded by people and I can't escape, maybe I'm frozen in fear, I'm flooded with emotions. Do I have a grounding object I can bring with me? Is it maybe a picture I keep in my pocket so I feel connected to them? Thinking about that as much as you can when things go sideways or if things go sideways. Being gentle with yourself and allowing yourself again that permission to say no, right? And knowing that that can change. You might initially agree to something, knowing that it might feel good. The day comes and maybe it's just a bad grief day, right? And allowing yourself that permission to say no, not feeling pressured to follow through on things if it's just not serving you that day, right? If it's not going to be helpful. Anytime you feel like you're kind of dragging yourself there, it's just like a big onerous chore. Think about that. Is this truly helping me to do this? Or am I just forcing myself into an uncomfortable situation that's just going to drain me further? Right? Allowing yourself permission to let some of those things go while also still maintaining that connection where you can. Right. And the last point there of just knowing that even though in grief, sometimes it can feel really dark and like the light at the end of the tunnel is really, really far away, that we can still absolutely have joy. Right. And so it might feel a bit out of reach, especially in this season when we're bombarded with it all the time. But know that those small moments of joy can still exist. Right. And just as we talk about the piece of being kind of in a moment or that kind of moment of contentment or moments of awe, those moments of joy can also be there. Right. And that may come from sharing just a story and having a moment of laughter where you just have a break from grief, which we all need. Right. Just allowing yourself to also feel joy without necessarily the guilt that comes with it. Right? Because that's something we hear over and over again is when I do allow myself to feel joy or happiness, I feel guilty because I've lost somebody. How could I dare feel something good? But we need that, right? We need that joy and happiness to pull us forward. That's what keeps us going. And so allowing yourself to just feel it and sit in that as well. As much as you sit in grief, we can also just sit and savor that little moment of joy when it comes up. Okay, so that's just something I want people to remember during the season is as hard as it can be, it doesn't have to all be bad if we just allow ourselves to feel all the emotions as they come. The last slide here is just a reminder for those that may be new to hospice or are watching this and aren't already connected to hospice. The hospice does offer a variety of supports as well in terms of bereavement support groups, as well as support through one-to-one volunteers. So these are just examples of the groups currently at hospice or coming soon. So coffee and conversation, the more structured bereavement support group, men's grief group, art therapy, yoga, which is always a popular one. We have done suicide loss or substance use loss as well in the past. Children's grief, we've got the gingerbread house activity coming up, caregiver support group, and we've also talked a little bit about more specified support for people who've experienced a loss through medical assistance in dying, because their experience and loss is so different. And the process of that is so different than kind of the natural death, right? And so we're looking at maybe adding that as an extra option for people who've experienced loss. So just to make sure you're aware of those supports. And if that's something you might be interested in or would find helpful, of course, call hospice and talk to Sarah, and she can connect you with that support if it's appropriate for you. Okay, so just to let you know, there is support there. We do know it's a hard season, so please don't hesitate to reach out, whether it's now or after the holidays, if you find that difficult. And this is the last little quote here that I like to share with people. It comes from a group called Option Be There. Something we've posted on our social media the last couple of years. Here's my holiday wishes for you now and always. May you remember that you are capable of getting to the other side of this. May you have a safe place to let go and have comfort close by, even if that means wearing the same sweatpants many days in a row, which many of us do in grief. May you have the courage to say no when you need to. May you show yourself kindness even when you think you should be stronger. May you find new things that bring you joy, feel in your bones the love people have for you, and trust that you will not feel lost forever. I just wanted to leave you with that message today. I think that idea of self-kindness and self-compassion, especially in grief, is so, so important, of allowing ourselves the grace that we would so easily give to others. We're always the hardest on ourselves, our hardest inner critics. Allowing yourself that compassion and kindness that you would give to anybody else going through this, and being okay with that. Right? And if that's something that you struggle with and just need a bit of guidance of what is this self-compassion, especially caregivers, we're not often used to thinking about self, we're used to worrying about our person, right, and what they're doing. If you need a little bit of guidance with that, I would also recommend connecting with the work of Dr. Kristen Neff, N-E-F-F, and I'm happy to share that resource as well if that would be helpful. And what she does is a lot of work on just giving yourself a break for a few minutes, right? Just acknowledging this is hard. I'm not alone in this experience. I'm not the first person to go through this. And then something that establishes safety. I will be okay, or this will pass, right? Or this is just a difficult moment and things will soften, right? And so the takeaway for grief is always, don't expect it to ever go away, right? Grief is a part of us forever. And it does ebb and flow in terms of intensity and duration, but it does tend to soften with time. And just know that to nurture what you need to do for yourself right now. Right. And so I'd recommend, if that's something you struggle with, to certainly check out the work of Dr. Kristen Neff, who's a fantastic resource at just how we can all be a little bit kinder to ourselves, especially during the holiday season. And then the last slide here is just resources for those who might want a little bit more information about some of the tips that we talked about today, or even just ways to share with others that may be struggling this holiday season. So thank you so much for coming today. And if there's any questions, I'm certainly here, and I'll stay on for a while, just in case, okay? And Sarah, let you facilitate that in the room, because it sometimes is hard to hear in that boardroom there. And for those that are online, feel free to throw any questions in the chat box as well. Sarah, are there any questions in the boardroom there?
We have no questions, Kate, but
Okay.
I just, from everybody here that's in the room and myself.
I don't have a question. I would just like to express my thanks for presentation.
Did you hear that, Kate?
I didn't. If you could repeat, that would be wonderful.
Helen was just expressing her many thanks for your presentation today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. And Tara, I saw your message online here as well. Thank you so much for that wonderful feedback. And I'm glad that all of you were able to be there today, whether in person or online. And again, for those attending in person, just know that hospice is here to support you through. We know it's a really difficult time, and just be kind to yourself. Be very gentle to yourself.
Thank you, Katie. Merry Christmas. Thank you.
Lots of thanks here.
Thank you so much. Wish I could see everybody, but thank you so much for coming. And I'm glad that you found it helpful today.